Hello, Stroke Warriors. Today we have a very special guest with us today. We have a gentleman who's been through a cardiac arrest and a couple other things, founded an organization. And what's the name of the organization again?
Griffith Blue Heart nonprofit.
Nice, nice. Well, anyway, introduce Brandon Griffith. How are you today, Brandon?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you for having me on, Ralph.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I appreciate you doing it. Let's
Absolutely.
get into the in your case, it was a cardiac arrest, right?
Yes, sir.
So can you take us back to the day of the cardiac arrest and what do you remember? And how did your wife, Melissa, save your life? That's an
Yeah,
interesting topic.
absolutely. So I'm one of the weird ones. I actually remember every single detail about my event. Most cardiac arrest survivors wake up in the hospital and they're told about it afterwards. I wish I could tell you I was doing something cool. Wish I could tell you that I was in a foot pursuit or saving a kid or in a fight. I was working as a police officer, but like 4 out of 5 cases, mine happened at home. My wife makes fun of me because I've been shot at. I've been in knife fights. I've been, trapped under a vehicle in a water rescue, and I died at home reading a book. You just can't make it up, right? So I was in my den sitting with my wife. She was working on the computer. I was reading a book. I put it down, stood up. I said, "Hey, I'm going to take the dog out." I took 2 steps towards my door, and something hit me like, you ever had someone jump out and scare you? And your heart skips that beat.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, imagine that fluttering, but you can't recover from it. In that moment, everything slowed way down. Even though I collapsed in about a second and a half, I experienced time distortion. Weird things happen in critical stress incidents, whether you're a police officer, military, firefighter. Weird things happen from auditory exclusion to tunnel vision to time distortion. And that's what happened to me. Everything just slowed way down. And I remember just stopping dead in my tracks, going, and something just didn't feel right. My heart was in this constant flutter. This electrical storm's going on, and I can't recover from it. So I'm trying to do what I'm trained to do, which is combat breathing. But it turns out when you're in ventricular fibrillation, there is no blood being pumped to your lungs. So your alveoli physically can't expand with oxygen. So I started just doing what's called agonal breathing. I was kind of convulsing in place, going, trying to force myself to breathe. So my wife hears this, turns around to look at me, and sees my face as the darkest purple she'd ever seen. She immediately pulls the phone out, calls 911, puts it on speaker, and drops it. I fall back into my bookshelf. She tries to kind of catch me now. I'm 6'4". My wife's about 5'3". So I topple right over her, put my head through the wall, and I land on my hands and my knees, and I'm staring out into my hallway. And I'm starting to experience tunnel vision, but it's nothing like I've experienced working the streets. My tunnel vision was this dark, dark, purplish black, and it was fluttering and closing in on me. Now I know that that was gravity taking the blood away from my brain and my ocular cavities. I was literally watching myself die. And here I was, a cop, an EMT. I don't know how many life saves I had underneath my belt at that time, but there isn't a damn thing I can do to save my own life. And I remember that feeling of helplessness and just being like, well, this is it. And in that moment, I collapsed. I dropped dead. My wife rolls me on my back. She starts to do compressions on me. She said I was in lockjaw. So she's actually smacking me across the face, trying to get me to snap out of it. And she had the presence of mind to actually put my feet up on the couch in our den in Trendelenburg. Now, Trendelenburg is a position we use in EMS for patients who are in shock. All the oxygenated blood that's in your legs has gravity forcing it down to your core. I can't get ER doctors or cardiovascular physicians to do that now, but she had the presence of mind doing that while working on our high school sweetheart. Just amazing. So she's compressing away, working on me. The first responder arrives. It's a fellow police officer. She has to stop working on me, hold the dog back, go open the front door. He comes in, sees me dead on the floor, and gets to work. He started doing compressions and worked on me until about the 9.5 minute mark when fire and EMS arrived. They dragged my body in the living room where they had some more room to work, cut off one of my favorite Nirvana shirts, dropped in an OPA, IO drilled me. They worked on me for a while, several shocks from the defibrillator, but all in all, they got a pulse back at 16 minutes and 48 seconds. Now, according to my wife and the crew, I sat up, started pushing guys off me. I don't remember that part. I remember the pain. I remember my chest feeling caved in. I could feel where they drilled through my leg. I could taste the blood in my mouth from where they dropped the OPA in. I remember my hands and legs felt like pins and needles everywhere. You know that painful feeling you get when you fall asleep on your hands and legs?
Yeah.
Imagine that, but like on steroids. And I definitely remember most of all my head. I mean, my head just felt like someone was taking a sledgehammer to it with every single heartbeat. I was getting that white flash, back of my eyeballs pounding. My wife grabbed me by the face, said, "Don't leave me." I said, "I won't." And that's when I collapsed backwards onto the floor. The guys loaded me up. Now, from that moment, I remember dying, death, coming back. But from that moment, all I can remember is the sway of the gurney and hearing the firefighters walk on the rocks in my front yard. The next 5 days, as my brain was recovering from hypoxia and from the concussion, are just kind of glimpses and photographs. Like the guys in the back of the ambulance said that I was, talking shit, calling them hose draggers, making jokes with them. I don't remember any part of that. I remember waking up in the ICU, and I remember in and out of consciousness, just little pictures and glimpses. And to this day, my wife still has to fill in those days, but that's pretty much what happened the day of the cardiac arrest.
Yeah. Well, it's funny with being stroke warrior radio. A lot of those symptoms are very similar to what we have as strokes. Um, as a law enforcement officer, um, what was your perception of first responders and after your cardiac arrest? I mean, you're a first responder yourself. Is the medical training enough to get? I mean, you had a guy obviously that jumped right on CPR.
So I'll tell you right now that law enforcement remains the single most underutilized component in the chain of survival. Now, it has adapted significantly and changed. When I first started my career in 2008, nobody was carrying bleeding control kits. The American College of Surgeons hadn't created the Stop the Bleed program. Nobody was carrying Narcan for opiate overdoses. I mean, if you carried a tourniquet, you were one of the weird guys and you were probably ex special forces. A lot of the guys just didn't have that training. Nobody had AEDs in their cars. You basically got like a CPR training course and they told you to, plug a bullet hole. That was the extent of most of the training. I mean, back in the academy, they were teaching us how to deal with rattlesnakes and delivering babies. So, I mean, there wasn't much that was really going on at that time period, but it really has adapted. Now, at least most agencies are doing TCCC. A lot of agencies are at least getting like a CPR card every 1 to 5 years, if you count that. They have people that are doing opiate reversal training, but my perception of him was always the highest respect. I mean, here I was a police officer. I used to be an EMT. I volunteered on the ambulances and in the hospital. I worked in the private sector before I went into law enforcement. And I grew up with law enforcement, military, and fire and EMS guys around me since the time I was 4. So I always had nothing but utmost respect because these men and women are thrown into the worst scenarios and they're expected to adapt on the fly. We're expected to be experts in everything. So it's just seeing it evolve in the last just decade alone is absolutely outstanding.
Great. Were there any surprises? Did it surprise you in the preparedness of the emergency medical personnel at all? I mean, were the EMSs right on top of it?
So EMS is right on top of it, but it's hard to say that I was surprised, but most people just don't understand the gravity of our EMS system and how it is not set up for success. So when it comes to the dispatch centers for EMS, think about fire crews and EMS crews. I got 4 guys on a fire truck, 2 guys on an ambulance. I lived half a mile away from a fire department the day that I had my cardiac arrest. So those guys were on a call for service, right? They have advocate response. If they're out with a patient who's hypoglycemic, they can't toss them a Snickers and say, "Hey, good luck, someone's worse than you down the street." So the next closest unit gets dispatched. Well, the next closest unit was on a car accident. So the next closest unit got dispatched. That's why it took them 9.5 something minutes to get to me. It's not because they didn't want to, and they do a damn good job, but the EMS system is not set up for success. That's where law enforcement can make the biggest differences because we've got entire squads of officers that are mobile in vehicles. We don't have 4 guys in one truck. We've got entire squads of people that are mobile. And most of the time, they're responding to calls in neighborhoods. They're going to domestic violence calls and taking calls for service and patrolling these neighborhoods. So they're able to get on scene in the first 1 to 4.5 minutes where you have the highest likelihood of resuscitation or stopping a bleed or reversing an overdose. So this is where the real surprises was just seeing the real surprise was it happening to me. I never thought it would happen to me at the age of 26, having just made my SWAT team and being in phenomenal shape. But it's the surprises of the training and preparedness at the time, they were actually pretty far ahead. There was a lot of agencies around the country that didn't get the training that these officers did. I mean, I had done CPR, I don't know how many times in the field before my cardiac arrest. I don't know how many times I had stopped bleeds or, gone to drug overdoses and had to react. So, I mean, I was actually quite proud of their medical training and how they responded. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them.
Well, I'm curious because, um, you've said cardiac arrest, you've said that Narcan, drug overdoses, stabbings or shootings. What, how much education has it grown for stroke in particular? Do
So
you see that?
there's been a lot of expansions in medical programs, everything from anaphylaxis to sucking chest wounds to stroke awareness. But the reality is, most of the time, law enforcement is not going to be able to do much when it comes to stroke besides coordinate response or load and go. So, like where I work for the sheriff's office right now, when we've got rural areas out there, if it's going to be another 20 minutes for an ambulance to even get on scene, we're being told to load them up and get them to the hospital as soon as possible, right? So, but there's not really much they can do. They're not a cath lab. They're not a mobile cath lab. There's not much that the fire and EMS can do on scene when it comes to a stroke. They got to get you to a stroke center. They got to get you to a level 1 trauma center in order to get you the best support possible. So there is training, there is awareness. They talk about facial drooping. There is awareness where they talk about signs of strokes and altered state of consciousness, gibberish. I mean, there's a whole bunch of checklists that they go over with law enforcement and EMS, but it's not there's not much they can really do for it. There's not a stroke kit or there's not a piece of equipment they can carry with them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Do you see any future in the expansion of that at all, or is it possible to expand that?
So there are programs and doing awareness and advocacy for law enforcement, getting them out there, sharing stories like yourself, sharing stories like raising signs of awareness and how to get things going. But the reality is what could they do more on scene?
Right,
They don't
right.
have medical oversight. They're not EMTs. They're not ACLS. They don't have that kind of training. And even if we were to get something for it, they're basically going to give you oxygen. They're going to give you some pharmaceuticals and get you straight to the hospital. You know what I mean? There's not much that even an ACLS crew can do for you
Okay.
when you're having a stroke on scene. Besides, recognize what's happening and get you there as soon as possible.
The reason for the line of questioning is, um, I think I've told you before, and I've told some of our listeners, but I had an ambulance, my first ambulance. I didn't call the ambulance till the next day because I wasn't aware of the signs of stroke. But the first ambulance came and asked me if I wanted to go to the hospital. I said, no, who the hell wants to go to the hospital? Do I have to? And I swear to you, he said, you already had your stroke, so you don't need to go to the hospital. What are your thoughts and the gaps of training or protocol that led to a situation like that?
So when you look nationwide, some of these kids that are working as EMTs maybe went through a college class and got thrown in because they're severely understaffed, they're severely underpaid, and they're severely overworked. So some of these guys, that could have been a kid fresh out of classroom without much field training, or that could have been somebody with a decade or two of experience. The reality is that across the country, there's a real lapse. Yes, there's the national certifications and registries for EMTs and whatnot, but some get very good training, some get very poor training, some are doing online classes and certifications now, but you can't replace real world experience. You can't replace that intuition that you get as you start actually working the streets and getting calls for service. So it is a little surprising that they recognize you had a stroke and didn't tell you needed to get to a facility, but there are going to be gaps in training everywhere you go. I mean, some agencies are very proactive and they do training, biannually, annually, every 2 years, every 5 years. Some places never get it again. You know what I mean? So it's just
Yeah.
there's a gaps all around the country, and there's areas that are very progressive and there's areas that are not.
Well, and that raises the point of what you do with your organization and I do with mine and the others I'm involved with, is raising awareness what the signs are. I mean, how many people have no idea? Like me, I took some ibuprofen and went to bed. You know, that was so we have to raise the awareness. So we'll talk about your organization a little bit, but let's get into the recovery journey because although we're different, they are similar in a lot of ways. What were some of the biggest physical challenges you faced during your recovery?
Physically, I was experiencing a lot. I definitely had brain fog. I definitely had some irritability. I was healing from the new AICD that was placed in my chest. I was still having some heart flutters and PVC clusters that were going on. They were starting me on some new medications. So I was definitely woozy. I was definitely weak. Initially had lost some of my fine motor skills. Um, Physically, I wasn't allowed to do much for the first, couple months as they were waiting for the lead to heal into my heart. They placed this new device in me, and I also had them place the device underneath my pectoral muscle because I knew I was trying to go back to law enforcement. I'm a lifelong martial artist. I'm very active. I wanted to make sure it was protected if it got impacted. If I got kicked in the chest or if I, crashed mountain biking, I wanted to make sure I didn't break the lead off and have to go into emergency surgery. So I had a little bit of a longer physical therapy and recovery than a lot of the other guys, but I had a lot of physical attributes that just changed. I went from beginning on my SWAT team, training, working out 5 days a week, hitting the weights, doing hit workouts, running obstacle courses, to being very inactive. And to keep me inactive, it kept me doped up so I wouldn't, rip this thing out of my heart. So I went from being very active to sitting around and eating. People are bringing you food. They're checking in on you and whatnot. So I gained a lot of weight. Physically, it was a lot to overcome when I was finally able to go back and do a little bit of cardiac rehab and work my way back to the streets.
Did you go to inpatient rehab or outpatient?
No, there's nothing. Cardiac arrest survivors are packed in we're pat on the back and like, hey, good job. You're one of the lucky ones, and that's it. We don't qualify for most of the rehab that myocardial patients get. So there was nothing. I had to do all my own. I had to do my own training, and it literally ended up with me passed out in the desert at one point when I was with my SWAT medic. So I pushed myself too far, and I ended up back in the hospital for a couple of days because I thought that I was ready and I wanted to go mountain biking, and I pushed myself beyond my capabilities and lost consciousness and ended up back in the ER.
One of the things that they don't tell us getting out of the hospital is the emotional and mental health struggles, such as fear of another cardiac event or stroke event, like I did during my initial stroke recovery. How did you cope with that?
So when it comes to fear of another cardiac event, I that's not something I really experienced. I embraced death very young. I had buried several friends in the line of duty. I had been shot at. I had been hit off the road in pursuits. I had been in burning buildings. I had been under vehicles and water rescues. I knew that every day I went to work, I may not make it home. So I was definitely, there was not a fear of death. And especially after experiencing what I did on the other side, I had zero fear of death. It was very calm. It was very peaceful. It was very comforting. It took away any kind of fear whatsoever. But I did experience mental health and emotional roller coasters. Now, when I say that, when it comes to this, when your body has let you down physically like that, there's an emotional roller coaster that you go through. But I'll say that from immaturity and not being ready, being a 26-year-old, DT instructor and field training officer and SWAT cop, I was not mentally ready to give up the job. And because of all the stigmas, they were trying to force me into medical retirement. And that took more of a mental health hit on me than anything else. Not being part of the brotherhood, not being part of the camaraderie, not doing the job I had worked my ass off to get to, not being able to respond to the calls and get the adrenaline rushes. And that was something I wasn't prepared for. Now I'm being told that, we're going to try to find a position for you as a civilian. And I lost everything that I'd worked so hard for when it came to my career. My identity was too entwined with my career, not who I was as a man. And that's something I was young and immature. I didn't see myself as Brandon, the husband, later on a father, Brandon, the friend. I only looked at myself in that one singular aspect. So emotionally, it turned to anger. It was like, who the hell are you to tell me what I can and can't do? I'm going back to work. And having just the emotional waves that hit you. So after you go through something like this, I mean, you're on extreme gratitude and happiness, and the next thing you know, you're sobbing. You're getting a wave of emotions that are coming at you. So I definitely had a lot of mental health things, but most of it was intertwined with me trying to get back to the career that I loved.
Did you seek counseling, or what did you do for your mental health struggles?
I tried to seek out. I contacted cardiac arrest survivor groups, and at the time, they were a joke. I mean, even to this day, a lot of them don't offer support. They want to do like a circle kumbaya thing, or they want to. So many times we're used as show ponies. It's okay. We're going to go to this conference, and you're going to share your story, and then you're going to be the opener for this researcher or this physician. They're not going to compensate you. He's going to get paid for it though. They're gonna spend 5 to 10 minutes, being the show pony, and then they're gonna talk about their research, and you're out of here. But there wasn't anything. Okay, well, what are my rights to go back to work? What does the ADA say? What complications am I going to have with my AICD? What about these medication side effects that I'm experiencing? None of the groups were prepared for that. They didn't have traumatologists. They didn't have pharmacologists to talk about the medication side effects. We didn't have technicians to talk to about our AICD complications. There was nothing really out there for support. Me, I had my faith, I had my family, I had my guys in the department, but I worked out. I did a lot of things to really cope with it. But honestly, so many people cope on the wrong things. They play the victim card. This happened to me. What if this happens to me again? Oh my God, I could die again. You beat the odds. You're here. And so many times people wanted to they built it up in their head instead of saying, look, I beat the odds. I'm one of the ones that survived. I need to be expressing gratitude. I need to be grateful from every moment I'm given with now. Be grateful for today, the moments with your wife, the moments with your kids, the moments with your friends. Like, focus on that, not if it's going to happen again and when it's going to happen again. It's not just a ticking time bomb. Make the most of it instead of dread it. So that's something that I realized, that having seen my friends buried in the line of duty, I saw their kids being raised without their fathers. I saw them not being able to be there for those special moments. And I said, that's not going to be me. I owe it to them. I owe it to everybody else who sacrificed their life in the line of duty to cherish and earn every single day that I'm giving. I'm gonna make the most out of it instead of dreading it. And that's one of the biggest ways I did that. But what Booker Washington said, if you want to lift yourself up, lift someone else up. So getting into service and helping others really got me out of that emotional funk. When I started working with other cardiac arrest survivors, when I started helping cops save lives, when I started helping them identify their heart health complications and getting screenings, the overwhelming feeling of righteousness that comes with that, and the high that comes with that is very hard to top. So being able to be there and support others really helped me along my journey in coping with the mental health issues that I was dealing with.
A lot of self-advocacy I can hear. What was the process like returning to duty, or have you returned to duty?
Yeah, I did. So this was almost 12 years ago, or 11 and a half years ago. So at first, my department, they didn't know anything about cardiac arrest. They thought that I had a heart attack at 26. They didn't know anything about it. So they're like, oh, he's damaged goods. He's got this device in his chest now. There's no way we can let him go back to the field. This is a liability. Luckily at the time, our assistant chief, Mark Mann, had my back. And I said, no, I'm going back to the field. I'm going to fight this. I'm going to fight the Peace Officer Standard and Training Association. I'm going to fight risk management. I'm going to fight the city. I'm going back to work. And there was a lot of red tapes, a lot of questions. Well, what happens with this device in your chest? Does your radio interfere with it? What happens if you get tased? What happens if this happens? There's all these what ifs, but the reality is I'm safer than any other officer out there. Police officers are at a 70 times higher risk for heart disease than the general public. We're 25 times more likely to die from heart disease than a violent encounter with a suspect. I was very physically fit, getting regular heart checks. I was on medication to prevent any issues, and I had a device implanted in my chest that would shock me instantly if I went back into cardiac arrest. The rest of the department was at a significantly higher risk, and if they went down, they needed CPR and AED, and they had a very minimal chance of surviving. So I said, the odds are in my favor. Let's fight this. And luckily at the time, the state trauma and EMS director, Dr. Ben Balbro, who's one of the creators of Hands Only CPR, his office contacted me and was like, hey, why don't you come down? When I told him my story, and I told him what I remembered, he wanted me to work with him on some studies. He wanted me to work with him at the CPR University of Arizona. And I said, no, I'm not interested in that. I don't want to be a public speaker. I don't want to do that stuff. I just want to go back to work. So I made a deal with him. I said, you help me go back to work, I'll come do these speaking engagements and work with you. Deal. So at the time, he oversaw the entire state's trauma and EMS division. So when he signs off on me, there's no one else above him to go to. So when he gave me the okay, everybody else was like, all right, well, we can't really argue with him. And I was able to go back to full active duty. And when I got back to work, that's when people try to treat me differently. Man, they mean well, but there's a lot of stigmas, and there's a lot of, oh, can you do this with your heart condition? Look, asshole, I don't have a heart condition. I had to outrun, I had to outfight, it took about 6 months to a year for them to realize I wasn't going to grab my chest and keel over. Once they realized that I was perfectly fine and I was able to outrun and outperform a lot of their guys, they were like, all right, Griffith's good. And they kind of stopped. But at first it was just they treated you very differently, and they kind of didn't know how to react to it. And you find yourself guarding your defibrillator a little bit more. You find you're at a higher risk of some issues, so you get nervous and you're going through the metal detectors because you know something can happen. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happened when I returned with that defibrillator, but
Yeah,
it's a journey
exactly.
to say the least. I had to even tase myself. When they asked the
My
questions, they said, well, what happens if you're tased? I'm like, that's a good question. So I contacted the manufacturer, and I contacted at the time Taser, and they're like, we don't recommend it. I said, well, what happens? We don't recommend it. That's not an answer. Like, I need to know. I'm a field training officer. I train officers that come straight out of the academy. A lot of these kids nowadays haven't had much fighting experience, and they go to their bat belt for their tools every time it hits the fan. So if they go for the taser and miss and hit me, I need to know that I'm not going to drop dead. So when they wouldn't give me any information, they started giving me the runaround for months upon end. I finally just called my medic. I said, hey, I'm taking a ride. Bring the monitor over. Bring your AED. I tased myself. It sucked for 5 seconds. I stood up. It was on the same day I was getting my device checked. I went in and met with the technician. I said, hey, how's everything looking? He's like, everything's fine. Why? So I got tased earlier. He goes, what? You realize you could have reset this thing to factory settings? You could have turned the pacemaker function on. You could have done this. And I'm like, and you knew that? He goes, well,
Yeah,
yeah.
why didn't you tell me
I
that?
said, well, I've been asking your company for the last 3 or 4 months and no one will give me a straight answer. He's like, well, they're worried about liability. I'm like, if you don't know, say you don't know. But if you knew that offhand as a regular technician, they knew as well. So like, don't play this liability game runaround. I need to know what happens. This is impacting me and my life.
Yeah, exactly. What's about, there's all kinds of gaps in CPR, AED training, AET availability. How's your nonprofit addressing that?
So one of the things we noticed is that law enforcement really is underutilized when it comes to time sensitive medical emergencies. And when we saw the state of the nation when it came to AED, some departments have them, some don't. Some have them in every patrol vehicle. Some are overseen. Some are being reported. A lot of them aren't being reported. Most AED programs are failing within 2 to 4 years because they didn't implement it correctly. When you look at these programs, the cardiac industry has no clue how to work with law enforcement. They just hope that they sell AEDs to them and they give them CPR cards from so and so association, and then they send them on their way. But those programs are designed for civilians, not for law enforcement. And it's a whole different ballgame. So they didn't have systems of care to support it. They didn't have sustainability. They didn't have field deployment plans. They didn't have medical direction. Or they didn't know if they were in legislative compliance. So when I really stepped into the cardiac industry and I'm like, why don't more cops have AEDs? And I saw the state of it. They have no idea how to even approach or work with cops. I'm like, this is something that I can do. I implement programs. I'm a firearms instructor. I'm a DT instructor. I'm a field training officer. I'm a GI. I train cops and I implement programs and entire training blocks for entire organizations. So I'm like, if it comes to implementing a new program, this is what my bread and butter is. And now I happen to be a cardiac arrest survivor. And I'm very fortunate because I've been able to be on every component of the chain of survival. I've worked in dispatch. I've been an EMT. I've been a bystander doing CPR. I've been an actual survivor. I've been a police officer doing it. I've been a trainer doing it. I've been a researcher doing it. I've been an instructor doing it. So I'm like, hey, this is how I can earn my second chance. So I started trying to figure out, how do I help cops save more lives? How do I implement successful programs? So I literally, from the bottom up, said, I'm not going to do it the way these guys have. I'm going to bring in chiefs of police. I'm going to bring in dispatch managers. I'm going to create programs from scratch, and we're going to implement something new for cops. We're going to give training specifically to them with reality based training around law enforcement needs, not civilians, and not this, here's your mannequins on the desk. You do 20 seconds of compression singing Staying Alive, and they say, okay, you're good. No, we're going to do quantifiable resuscitation training. We're going to do stress inoculation. We're going to do it around our field, the way we actually operate in the field. So we created our programs from scratch and helping them not only get funding through grants, corporate sponsors, state funding, county funding, federal funding, We also help them implement the programs, from policy writings to field deployment plans to sustainability to legislative compliance to medical direction. We incorporate a program from the top up, from the bottom up, doing dispatch protocols. And every time we do it, we are quadrupling survival. We're increasing non-fire and EMS AD applications by like 6,000% or something like that. We've got, increased brain outcomes of up to 360%. Our cops are absolutely going out there. They're enthusiastic about it. They're throwing AEDs on people. They're stopping bleeds. They're pulling kids out of pools. They're using Narcan. Once they get proper training that's meant for law enforcement, and you implement a system to support it, it is truly a sight to see once it's implemented.
That's fantastic. Oh my God. And when did you start your foundation?
It was a slow process. After I got back to the field, I realized how underutilized law enforcement really was. And I started off helping out agencies get AEDs. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. What policies do we implement? And there was no policies out there. So then I was like, all right, well, how do we create this? Now let's talk about dispatch protocols. Because some agencies, here in Arizona, Phoenix Police Department is the 5th largest agency in the country. If you have a cardiac arrest and there's a cop across the street, they don't get notified. It goes to fire and EMS, and they have no idea they could have saved a life. They might get a message on their MDC, but that's about it. So
Wow.
those are things that have to be addressed. Are the closest responders actually being dispatched to these calls? Whether it's sheriff's office, state police, federal, we need to get people there as quickly as possible. So it started to roll out, and we saw the gap in training. Most of these trainings were like, some firefighter or some civilian comes in, puts on a quick PowerPoint, gives you a refresher. You spend, a few seconds doing compressions on a mannequin or a clicker mannequin, and they're like, okay, you're certified, get out there. But they didn't have anything to deal with what we were dealing with. They weren't doing this on active crime scenes. They weren't dealing with blood spraying. They weren't dealing with multiple victims and triage. They weren't responding to shootings and having to do law enforcement functions first. They weren't pulling kids out of pools and having to think as a detective or for a criminal justice function. So we created a 1 and 2 day training course for law enforcement, which actually does a crawl, walk, run methodology. We have got classroom learning, we've got skills building, and then we've got stress inoculation, reality-based training scenarios. Coming from SWAT, working with hostage rescue, active shooter, barricades, open area rescues, we're very familiar with running reality-based training, but it wasn't being applied to medical emergencies. And that baffled my mind, because you look at this, last year we had 1,176 fatal police shootings. 700,000 Americans died from heart disease. 60,000 died from uncontrolled bleeding. 107,000 died from drug overdoses. 42,000 Americans died from motor vehicle accidents. We are much more likely to save a life than we ever going to have to take one. But they're not actually using measurement devices when it comes to resuscitation. They weren't measuring depth, recoil, fractionality limitations, brain perfusion. So we had to create programs that actually did stress inoculation and measured them in real time under stress. And that's where our programs have really just grown and have adapted over the years. We're doing not just training operators, we're doing train the trainers and having these guys go back and train their entire agencies on our behalf. That's where it kind of grew, and that's how it kind of started in 2014 to where it is now.
Is Griffith Blue Heart in just Arizona, or do you do this nationally?
We work with law enforcement all around the country. We've worked with federal, tribal, military, state police, county police. Just this in the last 6 months, we've been in Fairfax, Virginia, and DC area. We've been in Tri-City, Washington. We've been in San Diego. We've been in Pasadena. We've been in Northern Arizona, Hawaii. We're all over the place. We're willing to work with law enforcement wherever they're at.
Wow. Are you in Pima County or Maricopa, or?
I'm with Pinal County Sheriff's Office.
Oh, Pinal County. Okay. I lived in Tucson 25 years,
All right.
or Arizona anyway. So that's why I asked. Is there any, if you could tell every first responder or healthcare professional one thing to improve patient outcomes in emergencies, what would it be?
They're time sensitive. Time is the critical barrier. And that's something that is ignored a lot of times. People are trying to anticipate, well, is the fire department really around the corner? Should I be doing compressions? Should I do this? If I put direct pressure on that, should I use my kit? Doing nothing is killing them. Sitting there telling the fire department to hurry up doesn't do shit. Get down there and get to work. Start doing compressions. Start plugging that bullet wound. Start, working on that kid. Use your Narcan. Use your kits. Don't wait, act. Don't hesitate and don't wait for it. If you're not training, your skills are very perishable. Just like your firearms trainings are perishable, so are resuscitation skills. If you're not training and actually measuring yourself and putting yourself under stress inoculation, you're doing yourself a disservice, not just for the people you serve, but your own family members. You're not preparing your spouse, you're not preparing your kids, you're setting them up to watch you die, because we're the ones that are having the cardiac emergencies. We're the ones that are having strokes, heart attacks. We're the ones having TIAs. We're the ones that are going down, particularly in the first 3 to 5 years after retiring. You're seeing these officers go down. We don't have AEDs in our homes. They're not training them, preparing their spouses, because everybody else gets complacent around us. It's, well, if anything happens, my husband's a cop or my wife's a cop. She'll take care of it. They don't think it's ever going to happen to them. I never in a million years thought it was going to happen to me at 26 in great physical shape, having just made my SWAT team. But guess what? It can happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime. And young athletic males are actually at the highest risk. So time is the critical barrier. Don't wait. Get in there and get to work.
That's awesome. I wish they took the time for me. What lessons do you think from your recovery journey are universal for anybody from any kind of life-changing health event?
Everybody believes this lie that we have more time. Everybody believes that tomorrow is promised and that I can get to that tomorrow. And that's bullshit. You and I both know that. You never know when your time is up. Whether you're struck by lightning, hit by a bus, have a cardiac arrest, a stroke, your life and your time is not guaranteed. So learning to live each day in appreciation of that. If I was to die tomorrow, what am I doing to earn today? What am I going to do? And does my family know that I love them? Was I there for them? Did I put off something that I really wanted to do? Take that mentality to every single day in your life and express gratitude for everything you're doing. Live like you might die tomorrow, and you're going to change your perspective on everything.
And recognize those small victories every day, right?
Absolutely.
You sound like crazy busy. How do you balance advocacy, professional duties, and family life while still staying grounded in your mission?
So it's been tough. I've always been an adrenaline junkie. I never in a million years thought that I'd leave law enforcement full time. During the pandemic, I dropped to reserve status. That way I could actually keep the lights on for them. When the pandemic hit, training got canceled, grants got canceled and repurposed. We couldn't do in-person trainings. Just to keep the nonprofit going, I had to stop doing full-time law enforcement. So I dropped to reserve status so I could focus on the nonprofit and my family. And by doing that, I realized, yes, I missed being on the streets. I missed being the one actually jumping in the action, being in the stack and, doing the life-saving work myself, but I can make a far bigger impact preparing and training the trainers and implementing programs for entire agencies than I can do individually. So I learned to invest my time wisely, and I have to say no to a lot. There's so much I want to do with cardiac arrest survivors. There's so much I want to do when it comes to school response and legislation, and but my family comes first. They're my number one priority, and then working with the communities and being able to make the impacts. I can't tell you how many civilian organizations contact us and want us to do reality-based training for them. And I'm like, look, the impact is law enforcement. They're the ones that are quadrupling survival because they're on scene first 90% of the time. That's where my focus is going to be outside of my family. So we've had to turn down a lot of opportunities. We've had to turn down a lot of, you have to know where your mission is grounded and where you're going to make the biggest impact, and you have to execute that action plan. So that's kind of the best way that I can do it, is making a list of the things that I need to prioritize. Stop. I volunteered. I work with so many different councils. I sat on committees. I did all this work, and it was a lot of talking in circles, and I didn't see a lot of action. So I stopped doing that. I stopped playing the game, to stop listening to some of these guys that were only listening to their sponsors, that were only trying to benefit themselves. I'm like, I'm not going to waste my time doing this anymore for a title or accreditation. I'm mission focused. I'm family focused. And if I have to do it myself, I'm going to do it myself. So that's the way I approach life.
What advice would you give to the survivors about embracing their new normal?
But there's going to be ups, there's going to be downs. It's never going to be this straight path. It's going to come at you in waves. You're going to have setbacks. There's a bunch of things that come at you that you never think about. And the reality is medicine is a practice, not a science. And medical error is the third leading cause of death in the country. You have to be your own advocate. So know what you are capable of. When someone tells you you're probably not going to do this again, it doesn't mean that's a no. Think about what you can and can't do. You know your body, you can trust your body, and you can figure out where your limitations are. There could be consequences to that, but you just realize that there's always going to be something else that's going to pop up. And people don't think about long-term medication side effects. They don't think about what happens to them, when these young athletes are being put on these medicines for long term. They don't think about fertility issues. They don't think about issues where it's causing, increased triglycerides or long-term beta blocker issues. They don't think about those things. They don't think about, where do I have to balance this? How do I make these changes to my AICD? What do I do for this? What do I do for that? They're going to come at you in waves. You're going to have to roll with it. It's okay to have downtimes and it's okay to be impacted by it, but you can't let it define you. You can't play the victim. You got to figure out, okay, this is my new norm. How do I make the best of this? How do I push this further?
Love it. Anything you want to add today to our conversation anyway? So we get into how they get a hold of you.
Well, if anyone's interested in supporting Griffith Blue Heart, you can go to griffithblueheart.com. We are a nonprofit. These programs are very expensive to implement for entire agencies. If you want to support us, or if you want to help us do fundraising, if you want to donate to us, if you want to just reach out to us, you can go to griffithblueheart.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm under Brandon Griffith. Griffith Blue Heart is also on Instagram. But just earn each day. You never know when your time is up. You never know when your number could get punched. So earn every day you're given. At the end of each day, I look at myself and go, was I a good enough husband? Was I a good father? Did I help someone today? Did I make an impact? Did I make the most of it? If I can't say that I did, I don't feel like I earned that day. If you take that approach, you're going to notice your life going in an upward trajectory.
And brought up one more question is, are your trainings available any other place besides law enforcement or?
For the most part, no. For the most part, our
Okay.
focus is on law enforcement. We do private security and we also do executive protection work. So we help out those that mostly in the military, mostly in law enforcement. That's where our main bread and butter is. We will make exceptions here and there, but it's on a case to case base, just because that's where the biggest impacts are going to be. Later on down the line, could we create a civilian track where we're creating trainers that want to do reality based training? That's what I'd like to see. For the most part, people just don't understand what real training is. They sit through a PowerPoint and they do these very low stress activities. They're not actually pulling people out from a bathroom stall. They're not actually lifting dead weight. They're not actually doing performances. They're not measuring it. They're not using feedback devices. They're not putting themselves under stress. They don't have auditory screams. They don't have blood curdling things going on in the background. That's where you need to know where you're going to perform. Just like, I can take a guy out all day and he can shoot a piece of paper. Is he prepared for a gunfight? Absolutely not. I don't care how good you can shoot a piece of paper until the bullets are actually flying and you have to work in a rapid dynamic atmosphere when you get adrenaline dumps and stress is flying all through the place. You don't know what your merit is. So you can't replace experience, but you can train for it. So at least take your training to the next level and realize that, have I really ever measured myself? Have I done compressions on feedback mannequins? Have I ever actually got a printout score? Have I ever seen, am I getting my depth? Am I getting my recoil? Am I staying in my ranges? If you're not, step up your level, go somewhere else where you can actually get tested with that, where they have the proper equipment. Don't just go through and sit through a CPR class every couple of years because your boss told you to do it. Take your family's security to the next level. Go buy an AED. 4 out of 5 cases happen inside the home. Are you prepared if your wife or your kid goes down right now? Do you have an AED in your home?
No, I don't.
No. And you're a
Great
stroke
point.
survivor. That's what I'm saying, is that people don't, even in the cardiac communities that I deal with, I speak before scientific advisory councils. I work with advisors that speak nationally around the country. And every time I deal with these people, I always ask them, do you guys have AEDs in your home? And almost none of them raise their hand. I'm like, you guys know the risks. You guys are preaching the risks. You guys are telling everybody else. But the reality is the cardiac community focuses on public access defibrillation programs. That's only 20% of cases. We know 80% are happening inside the home. So why aren't they preparing their own homes? Why aren't we getting AEDs in apartment complexes and condo communities? Why aren't we getting them in new home builds? That's where it should be at. Yes, we need them in our schools, we need them in our airports, we need them in public areas. I'm all about that. But we need to start actually approaching where it's going to get used the most. And until the AED industry starts making AEDs that are more affordable and that are actually adaptable for the general public, we're not going to see much changing. The AED industry is an $18 billion industry, and it's weird. Everywhere else you go, prices go down after years. Now, look at something like, smartphones. You get a smartphone. When they first came out, they were $1,000. Now you can go get an Android or an old iPhone for like what, $150 at the store.
Oh,
iPads were $1,000 when they first came out. Now you can go get a refurbished one on Amazon for like $117, right? Why is it that AEDs, even the ones that are 30 something years old from the early 90s, are going up and up and up and up in prices? They're now 2,000 something bucks instead of 900 something bucks. And it's going to continue to go that way because they're going towards the corporations. They're selling to corporations that have the money. They're not focusing on people who need it inside the home.
that's cool. Great point. Great point.
We spent all this money on fire extinguishers. We spent all this money on sensors and sprinkler systems. If we spent a tenth of that on AEDs for new homes, you'd see a huge impact on survival.
Thank you for that. And that's a great thing to start thinking about. Brandon, thank you so much for today. I really appreciate your information. I think our listeners will too. And you have a great day.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your time.
All right.